Section 4 of Essays of Schopenhauer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Malls Byron, Chicago. Essays of Schopenhauer by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by Sarah Hay Dirks. Chapter 4 on Authorship and Style. Style is the physiognomy of the mind. It is a more reliable key to character than the physiognomy of the body. To imitate another person's style is like wearing a mask. However fine the mask, it soon becomes insipid and intolerable because it is without life, so that even the ugliest living face is better. Therefore authors who write in Latin and imitate the style of the old writers essentially wear a mask. One certainly hears what they say, but one cannot watch their physiognomy, that is to say, their style. One observes, however, the style in the Latin writings of men who think for themselves, those who have not deigned to imitate, as, for instance, Scotus Eriginea, Petrarch, Bacon, Descartes, Spinoza, etc. Affectation in style is like making grimaces. The language in which a man writes is the physiognomy of his nation. It establishes a great many differences, beginning from the language of the Greeks down to that of the Caribbean islanders. We should seek for the faults in the style of another author's works, so that we may avoid committing the same in our own. In order to get a provisional estimate of the value of an author's productions, it is not exactly necessary to know the matter on which he has thought or what it is he has thought about it. This would compel one to read the whole of his works. But it will be sufficient to know how he has thought. His style is an exact expression of how he has thought, of the essential state and general quality of his thoughts. It shows the formal nature, which must always remain the same, of all the thoughts of a man, whatever the subject on which he has thought, or what it is he has said about it. It is the dough out of which all his ideas are kneaded, however various they may be. When Eulenspiegel was asked by a man how long he would have to walk before reaching the next place, and gave the apparently absurd answer, "Walk," his intention was to judge from the man's walking how far he would go in a given time. And so it is when I have read a few pages of an author, I know about how far he can help me. In the secret consciousness that this is the condition of things, every mediocre writer tries to mask his own natural style. This instantly necessitates his giving up all idea of being naive, a privilege which belongs to superior minds sensible of their superiority, and therefore sure of themselves. For instance, it is absolutely impossible for men of ordinary intelligence to make up their minds to write as they think. They resent the idea of their work looking too simple. It would always be of some value, however, if they would only go honestly to work and in a simple way express the few and ordinary ideas they have really thought. They would be readable and even instructive in their own sphere. But instead of that, they try to appear to have thought much more deeply than is the case. The result is they put what they have to say into forced and involved language, create new words and prolix periods, which go round the thought and cover it up. They hesitate between the two attempts of communicating the thought and of concealing it. They want to make it look grand so that it has the appearance of being learned and profound, thereby giving one the idea that there is much more in it than one perceives at the moment. Accordingly, they sometimes put down their thoughts in bits, in short, equivocal, and paradoxical sentences which appear to mean much more than they say. A splendid example of this kind of writing is furnished by Schelling's treatises on natural philosophy. Sometimes they express their thoughts in a crowd of words and the most intolerable diffuseness, as if it were necessary to make a sensation in order to make the profound meaning of their phrases intelligible, while it is quite a simple idea if not a trivial one. Examples without number are supplied in Fichte's popular works and in the philosophical pamphlets of 100 other miserable blockheads that are not worth mentioning. Or else they endeavor to use a certain style in writing which it has pleased them to adopt. For example, a style that is so thoroughly profound and scientific, where one is tortured to death by the narcotic effects of long-spun periods that are void of all thought. Examples of this are specially supplied by those most impertinent of all mortals, the Hegelians, in their Hegel newspaper commonly known as Jahrbücher der wissenschaftlichen Literatur. Or again, they aim at an intellectual style where it seems then as if they wish to go crazy, and so on. All such efforts whereby they try to postpone the nascetur ridiculusmus make it frequently difficult to understand what they really mean. Moreover, they write down words, nay, whole periods, which mean nothing in themselves, in the hope, however, that someone else will understand something from them. Nothing else is at the bottom of all such endeavors but the inexhaustible attempt, which is always venturing on to new paths, to sell words for thoughts, and by means of new expressions, or expressions used in a new sense, turns of phrases and combinations of all kinds, to produce the appearance of intellect in order to compensate for the want of it, which is so painfully felt. It is amusing to see how, with this aim in view, first this mannerism and then that is tried. These they intend to represent the mask of intellect. This mask may possibly deceive the inexperienced for a while, until it is recognized as being nothing but a dead mask, when it is laughed at and exchanged for another. We find a writer of this kind sometimes writing in a dithyrambic style as if he were intoxicated. At other times, nay, on the very next page, he will be high-sounding, severe, and deeply learned, prolix to the last degree of dullness, and cutting everything very small like the late Christian Wolff, only in a modern garment. The mask of unintelligibility holds out the longest. This is only in Germany, however, where it was introduced by Fichte, perfected by Schelling, and attained its highest climax finally in Hegel, always with the happiest results. And yet nothing is easier than to write so that no one can understand. On the other hand, nothing is more difficult than to express learned ideas so that everyone must understand them. All the arts I have cited above are superfluous if the writer really possesses any intellect, for it allows a man to show himself as he is, and verifies for all time what Horace said, Scribendi recte sapere est in principium et fons. But this class of authors is like certain workers in metal, who try 100 different compositions to take the place of gold, which is the only metal that can never have a substitute. On the contrary, there is nothing an author should guard against more than the apparent endeavor to show more intellect than he has, because this rouses the suspicion in the reader that he has very little, since a man always affects something, be its nature what it may, that he does not really possess. And this is why it is praise to an author to call him naive, for it signifies that he may show himself as he is. In general, naivete attracts, while anything that is unnatural everywhere repels. We also find that every true thinker endeavors to express his thoughts as purely, clearly, definitely, and concisely as ever possible. This is why simplicity has always been looked upon as a token, not only of truth, but also of genius. Style receives its beauty from the thought expressed, while with those writers who only pretend to think, it is their thoughts that are said to be fine because of their style. Style is merely the silhouette of thought, and to write in a vague or bad style means a stupid or confused mind. Hence the first rule. Nay, this in itself is almost sufficient for a good style, is this, that the author should have something to say. Ah, this implies a great deal. The neglect of this rule is a fundamental characteristic of the philosophical and, generally speaking, of all the reflective authors in Germany, especially since the time of Fichte. It is obvious that all these writers wish to appear to have something to say, while they have nothing to say. This mannerism was introduced by the pseudo-philosophers of the universities, and may be discerned everywhere, even among first literary notabilities of the age. It is the mother of that forced and vague style which seems to have two, nay, many meanings, as well as of that prolix and ponderous style, le style imposé, and of that no less useless bombastic style, and finally of that mode of concealing the most awful poverty of thought under a babble of inexhaustible chatter that resembles a clacking mill, and is just as stupefying. One may read for hours together without getting hold of a single clearly defined and definite idea. The Hallischen, afterwards called the Deutschen Jahrbücher, furnishes almost throughout excellent examples of this style of writing. The Germans, by the way, from force of habit, read page after page of all kinds of such verbiage without getting any definite idea of what the author really means. They think it all very proper and do not discover that he is writing merely for the sake of writing. On the other hand, a good author who is rich in ideas soon gains the reader's credit of having really and truly something to say, and this gives the intelligent reader patience to follow him attentively. An author of this kind will always express himself in the simplest and most direct manner, for the very reason that he really has something to say, because he wishes to awaken in the reader the same idea he has in his own mind, and no other. Accordingly, he will be able to say with Boileau, Ma pensée au grand jour partout s'offre et s'expose, et mon vers, bien ou mal, dit toujours quelque chose. While of those previously described writers it may be said, in the words of the same poet, Et qui parlant beaucoup ne disent jamais rien. It is also a characteristic of such writers to avoid, if it is possible, expressing themselves definitely so that they may always be able in case of need to get out of a difficulty. This is why they always choose the more abstract expressions, while people of intellect choose the more concrete, because the latter bring the matter closer to view, which is the source of all evidence. This preference for abstract expressions may be confirmed by numerous examples. A specially ridiculous example is the following. Throughout German literature of the last 10 years, we find to condition almost everywhere used in place of to cause or to effect. Since it is more abstract and indefinite, it says less than it implies, and consequently leaves a little back door open to please those whose secret consciousness of their own incapacity inspires them with a continual fear of all definite expressions. While with other people it is merely the effect of that national tendency to immediately imitate everything that is stupid in literature and wicked in life, this is shown in either case by the quick way in which it spreads. The Englishman depends on his own judgment both in what he writes and what he does, but this applies less to the German than to any other nation. In consequence of the state of things referred to, the words to cause and to effect have almost entirely disappeared from the literature of the last 10 years, and people everywhere talk of to condition. The fact is worth mentioning because it is characteristically ridiculous. Everyday authors are only half conscious when they write, a fact which accounts for their want of intellect and the tediousness of their writings. They do not really themselves understand the meaning of their own words because they take ready-made words and learn them. Hence they combine whole phrases more than words, phrases banales. This accounts for that obviously characteristic want of clearly defined thought. In fact, they lack the dye that stamps their thoughts. They have no clear thought of their own. In place of it we find an indefinite, obscure interweaving of words, current phrases, worn-out terms of speech, and fashionable expressions. The result is that their foggy kind of writing is like print that has been done with the old type. On the other hand, intelligent people really speak to us in their writings, and this is why they are able to both move and entertain us. It is only intelligent writers who place individual words together with a full consciousness of their use and select them with deliberation. Hence their style of writing bears the same relation to that of those authors described above, as a picture that is really painted does to one that has been executed with a stencil. In the first instance, every word, just as every stroke of the brush, has some special significance, while in the other everything is done mechanically. The same distinction may be observed in music, for it is the omnipresence of intellect that always and everywhere characterizes the works of the genius, and analogous to this is Lichtenberg's observation, namely that Garrick's soul was omnipresent in all the muscles of his body. With regard to the tediousness of the writings referred to above, it is to be observed in general that there are two kinds of tediousness, an objective and a subjective. The objective form of tediousness springs from the deficiency of which we have been speaking, that is to say, where the author has no perfectly clear thought or knowledge to communicate. For if a writer possesses any clear thought or knowledge, it will be his aim to communicate it, and he will work with this end in view. Consequently, the ideas he furnishes are everywhere clearly defined, so that he is neither diffuse, unmeaning, nor confused, and consequently not tedious. Even if his fundamental idea is wrong, yet in such a case it will be clearly thought out and well pondered. In other words, it is at least formally correct, and the writing is always of some value. While, for the same reason, a work that is objectively tedious is at all times without value. Again, subjective tediousness is merely relative. This is because the reader is not interested in the subject of the work, and that what he takes an interest in is of a very limited nature. The most excellent work may therefore be tedious subjectively to this or that person, just as, vice versa, the worst work may be subjectively diverting to this or that person, because he is interested in either the subject or the writer of the book. It would be of general service to German authors if they discerned that while a man should, if possible, think like a great mind, he should speak the same language as every other person. Men should use common words to say uncommon things, but they do the reverse. We find them trying to envelop trivial ideas in grand words and to dress their very ordinary thoughts in the most extraordinary expressions and the most outlandish, artificial, and rarest phrases. Their sentences perpetually stalk about on stilts. With regard to their delight in bombast, and to their writing generally in a grand, puffed up, unreal, hyperbolical, and acrobatic style, their prototype is Pistol, who was once impatiently requested by Falstaff, his friend, to say what you have to say like a man of this world. There is no expression in the German language exactly corresponding to style empressé, but the thing itself is all the more prevalent. When combined with unnaturalness, it is in works what affected gravity, grandness, and unnaturalness are in social intercourse, and it is just as intolerable. Poverty of intellect is fond of wearing this dress, just as stupid people in everyday life are fond of assuming gravity and formality. A man who writes in this précieux style is like a person who dresses himself up to avoid being mistaken for or confounded with the mob, a danger which a gentleman, even in his worst clothes, does not run. Hence, just as a plebeian is recognized by a certain display in his dress and his tiré à quatre épingles, so is an ordinary writer recognized by his style. If a man has something to say that is worth saying, he need not envelop it in affected expressions, involved phrases, and enigmatical innuendos, but he may rest assured that by expressing himself in a simple, clear, and naive manner, he will not fail to produce the right effect.
A man who makes use of such artifices as have been alluded to betrays his poverty of ideas, mind, and knowledge. Nevertheless, it is a mistake to attempt to write exactly as one speaks. Every style of writing should bear a certain trace of relationship with the monumental style, which is indeed the ancestor of all styles, so that to write as one speaks is just as faulty as to do the reverse, that is to say, to try and speak as one writes. This makes the author pedantic and at the same time difficult to understand. Obscurity and vagueness of expression are at all times and everywhere a very bad sign. In 99 cases out of 100, they arise from vagueness of thought, which in its turn is almost always fundamentally discordant, inconsistent, and therefore wrong. When a right thought springs up in the mind, it strives after clearness of expression, and it soon attains it, for clear thought easily finds its appropriate expression. A man who is capable of thinking can express himself at all times in clear, comprehensible, and unambiguous words. Those writers who construct difficult, obscure, involved, and ambiguous phrases most certainly do not rightly know what it is they wish to say. They have only a dull consciousness of it, which is still struggling to put itself into thought. They also often wish to conceal from themselves and other people that in reality they have nothing to say. Like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, they wish to appear to know what they do not know, to think what they do not think, and to say what they do not say. Will a man, then, who has something real to impart, endeavor to say it in a clear or an indistinct way? Quintilian has already said, Plerumque accidit ut faciliora sint, ad intelligendum et lucidiora multo, quae ad doctissimo quoque dicuntur, erit ergo etiam obscurior, quoquisque deterior. A man's way of expressing himself should not be enigmatical, but he should know whether he has something to say or whether he has not. It is an uncertainty of expression which makes German writers so dull. The only exceptional cases are those where a man wishes to express something that is in some respect of an illicit nature. As anything that is far-fetched generally produces the reverse of what the writer has aimed at, so do words serve to make thought comprehensible, but only up to a certain point. If words are piled up beyond this point, they make the thought that is being communicated more and more obscure. To hit that point is the problem of style and a matter of discernment, for every superfluous word prevents its purpose from being carried out. Voltaire means this when he says, L'adjectif est l'ennemi du substantif. But truly, many authors try to hide their poverty of thought under a superfluity of words. Accordingly, all prolixity and all binding together of unmeaning observations that are not worth reading should be avoided. A writer must be sparing with the reader's time, concentration, and patience. In this way he makes him believe that what he has before him is worth his careful reading, and will repay the trouble he has spent upon it. It is always better to leave out something than is good to write down something that is not worth saying. Hesiod's Pleonymisipandos finds its right application. In fact, not to say everything. Le secret pour être ennuyeux, c'est de tout dire. Therefore, if possible, the quintessence only, the chief matter only, nothing that the reader would think for himself. The use of many words in order to express little thought is everywhere the infallible sign of mediocrity, while to clothe much thought in a few words is the infallible sign of distinguished minds. Truth that is naked is the most beautiful, and the simpler its expression, the deeper is the impression it makes. This is partly because it gets unobstructed hold of the hearer's mind without his being distracted by secondary thoughts, and partly because he feels that here he is not being corrupted or deceived by the arts of rhetoric, but that the whole effect is got from the thing itself. For instance, what declamation on the emptiness of human existence could be more impressive than Job's? Homo natus de muliere brevi vivit tempore, repletus multis miseriis, qui tanquam flos egreditur et conteritur, et fugit velut umbra. It is for this very reason that the naive poetry of Goethe is so incomparably greater than the rhetorical of Schiller. This is also why many folk songs have so great an effect upon us. An author should guard against using all unnecessary rhetorical adornment, all useless amplification, and in general, just as in architecture, he should guard against an excess of decoration, all superfluity of expression. In other words, he must aim at chastity of style. Everything that is redundant has a harmful effect. The law of simplicity and naivete applies to all fine art, for it is compatible with what is most sublime. True brevity of expression consists in a man only saying what is worth saying, while avoiding all diffuse explanations of things which everyone can think out for himself. That is, it consists in his correctly distinguishing between what is necessary and what is superfluous. On the other hand, one should never sacrifice clearness, to say nothing of grammar, for the sake of being brief. To impoverish the expression of a thought, or to obscure or spoil the meaning of a period for the sake of using fewer words, shows a lamentable want of judgment. And this is precisely what that false brevity nowadays in vogue is trying to do. For writers not only leave out words that are to the purpose, but even grammatical and logical essentials. Subjectivity, which is an error of style in German literature, is, through the deteriorated condition of literature and neglect of old languages, becoming more common. By subjectivity, I mean when a writer thinks it is sufficient for himself to know what he means and wants to say, and it is left to the reader to discover what is meant. Without troubling himself about his reader, he writes as if he were holding a monologue, whereas it should be a dialogue, and, moreover, a dialogue in which he must express himself all the more clearly as the questions of the reader cannot be heard. And it is for this very reason that style should not be subjective but objective. And for it to be objective, the words must be written in such a way as to directly compel the reader to think precisely the same as the author thought. This will only be the case when the author has borne in mind that thoughts, inasmuch as they follow the law of gravity, pass more easily from head to paper than from paper to head. Therefore, the journey from paper to head must be helped by every means at his command. When he does this, his words have a purely objective effect, like that of a completed oil painting, while the subjective style is not much more certain in its effect than spots on the wall, and it is only the man whose fantasy is accidentally aroused by them that sees figures. Other people only see blurs. The difference referred to applies to every style of writing as a whole, and it is also often met with in particular instances. For example, I read in a book that has just been published, "I have not written to increase the number of existing books." This means exactly the opposite of what the writer had in view, and is nonsense into the bargain. A man who writes carelessly at once proves that he himself puts no great value on his own thoughts. For it is only by being convinced of the truth and importance of our thoughts that there arises in us the inspiration necessary for the inexhaustible patience to discover the clearest, finest, and most powerful expression for them, just as one puts holy relics or priceless works of art in silver or golden receptacles. It was for this reason that the old writers, whose thoughts expressed in their own words have lasted for thousands of years and hence bear the honored title of classics, wrote with universal care. Plato, indeed, is said to have written the introduction to his Republic 7 times with different modifications. On the other hand, Germans are conspicuous above all other nations for neglect of style in writing, as they are for neglect of dress, both kinds of slovenliness which have their source in the German national character. Just as neglect of dress betrays contempt for the society in which a man moves, so does a hasty, careless, and bad style show shocking disrespect for the reader, who then rightly punishes it by not reading the book. End of section 4.